why I'm here presenting this genre and not something else. So you're really gonna you're gonna learn a lot. We're gonna have a lot of fun throughout this. We'll give it another minute or so before we get started at the 7:45 mark. But we're gonna be pretty much touching upon all of the things that make Cyberpunk Cyberpunk, and then all the shows that are that have both changed the genre or revolutionized it, or that just did something so different that you just have to discuss about it because it's not your cookie cutter type of show. And there's a lot of titles, especially the last 20 or so years, that have been wildly different than the first 20 or so years of Cyberpunk. And this genre is just ever changing and ever so interesting. So we'll start in about a minute. I have 7:44 on my clock, so we'll give it one more minute. 7:45 mark, we will get started, and we're gonna have a fun night.
Hey, wasn't Trigger working on some Cyberpunk 2077 anime?
Yep. So we're working on Cyberpunk 2077 Edge Runner, I believe is the specific title. That, I want to say it's towards the tail end of this year that it's supposed to come out. I've heard a lot of different dates thrown around on when it will come out, and I think that's kind of been the trend for a lot of the newer big name titles of Cyberpunk that people know before they just come out. So not the non-originals. They're like, oh, it's coming out this fall. No, it's next. No, a couple years from now. We'll get to it. So I'm not quite sure when it will come out, but yes, that was one that's being worked on, and that should be really, really cool. One trigger is just amazing. They hit it out of the park every single time they do anything. So, all right, we are going to get started. It's 7:45. It is Saturday night at Zenkaikon 2022. We're having a lot of fun here. If you cannot hear me at all throughout this panel, just tell me to speak louder, and I will. I'm a very loud person. I want to make sure that you can hear what's going on and that you are all set and ready to go as we dive into the history of Cyberpunk anime and kind of its origins and where it started, where it's going, what kind of themes we can take away, what things we can learn about just a lot of shows throughout its history, and kind of where we might be seeing the genre change throughout its time. But we have to start really at the very beginnings of the genre before we actually get into anime and kind of how Cyberpunk started. And that was back in the 80s, two really pinnacle works, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner and William Gibson's Neuromancer. We'll talk about Neuromancer first. This is, even though it came out a little bit later, it came out in 1984, just a couple years after Blade Runner did. This was kind of the piece that coined the term cyberpunk. A lot of the things we'll be talking to, you can relate back to Neuromancer. Neuromancer set the stage for what a cyberpunk kind of is. There are three real basic elements in Neuromancer. We have this idea of high technology. Talk about cyberpunk here. Technology is going to be involved. Then we went on to a ruined society, whether it was by war, by nuclear disaster, environmental disaster, or just pollution, garbage, or the author decides to just make it in a messed up place. And then finally, going off that environmental aspect, we see this idea of a tarnished global environment. Oftentimes it is, you'll see acid rain or smog, dark skies, a lot of fog and pollution. Other times it's just both social aspect of that, and that the global world is broken apart. There is no longer this connectivity. I'm pretty sure the UN would never exist in most cyberpunks. So this was kind of how Neuromancer did. And Neuromancer took this with kind of this dark, heavy atmosphere, set in urban environments. Think, like the next title we'll be talking about, Blade Runner is. You can even see a lot of this within Ghost in the Shell. A lot of this we have a plot with lower classes, criminals, outlaws, thieves, think a more recent title like Akudama Drive, and where you kind of have this, a lot more of the lawlessness that's involved, and that comes from Neuromancer. But then you look at Blade Runner. Now, Blade Runner came out 2 years before Neuromancer, but it didn't set the tone of cyberpunk from a definition standpoint. It kind of set the idea of what looks like a cyberpunk. Blade Runner has these big skyscrapers, high rises, bright lights, floating cars, big screens, kind of the things that we see in Bubblegum Crisis later in the 80s. And that's really where Blade Runner got its name. Now, Blade Runner, when it came out, was not a hit. It was not a success, but it became a cult classic and really became a hit much, much later in its lifestyle. But it helped all the way to today. Those two pieces, they set the stage of what cyberpunk is. But animation didn't start really with Japan, with anime, when it came to cyberpunk. It actually started over here, both here in the US and in Canada, in the early 80s, with heavy metal and rock and roll, which are coined really the first two animated cyberpunks. Heavy Metal, which was a Canadian-American sci-fi, it was based off of this anthology magazine, Heavy Metal. And it was a pretty good success at the time. There are still a lot of showings, especially on its anniversary. It is a very heavily popular show, and there's a lot of people that will go back and dive into the magazines. It was very successful. It cost about $9.3 million to make at the time. It doubled its value and was more successful at the time of release than Blade Runner. It was the thing. Well, at least it should have been. It starred a lot of awesome musical talents from the punk rock scene. Lou Reed, Iggy Pop, Cheap Trick. I mean, this was going to be a success. Except punk rockers and punk rock fans didn't want to go to a movie theater to see a mainstream film. It cost $8 million to make. It made $30,000. Yeah, it didn't really work so well. Now, today it is a cult hit. I have seen it at local theaters very often. It is another one that got plenty of recap much later in its lifetime. But these two images kind of help capture a lot of the things that we will see throughout this panel. Worlds that are very computerized. Looks like we're inside a computer town. Worlds with lasers and bright lights and very much this aesthetic that we kind of coin as a cyberpunk aesthetic. But it's a lot more than just the looks. You can look like a cyberpunk, but you feel like a cyberpunk. The genre itself doesn't really have a definition. There's attempts at it, but there's no definition that captures all of cyberpunk, and I know this is not going to capture everything. What cyberpunk is, and that's what we're going to kind of start our definition as, and it may change, it may fuse as we go through this panel. The big things, though, are with those parts from Neuromancer. We see that technological advances, they are at an all-time high. We see high technology in this society. Often, we'll see a lot of robots and AI, androids, but as we increase the technology in the world, the welfare of that world, especially the social classes, kind of drop. We do see this huge disparities in a lot of the shows that we're talking about. On the other hand, we look at the environment, the setting. It's usually in a dystopian society, it's usually in a city, and oftentimes they're either isolated because of war or disaster, they might be in a bubble. Something is causing people to have to be in that city. So take a look at things and kind of put them in the back of your head, think about them, and you're going to see a lot of these repeat as we go through this panel. As for the themes, before we really dive into the shows, there's some themes that overarch through all of history. Some are a little bit more limited, but these are kind of the big ones. And the top one here, the quest for identity, is the most important that I want you to focus on. Almost every cyberpunk anime, especially the ones that we talk about today, that's the major theme. Who are you? identity plays such a huge role within Cyberpunk. Now, it could be wrapped up in a quest. It could be wrapped up into seeing AI. It could be wrapped up in finding whether an AI is very human-like or very robot-like. We'll see that throughout in a lot of different forms and different environments. We'll see throughout the ages this man versus machine or machine versus man very often. We'll see the government's going to play a huge role within a lot of these shows. We will see a lot of discrimination. We'll see a lot of conspiracies. These don't always fit every single show, but we see them throughout a lot of different titles. So with that, let's start off in the 80s, where we start seeing our first Cyberpunk titles. 3 of them that I have captured here: Techno Police 21C, Gray Digital Target, and a personal favorite of mine, Goku Midnight Eye, were 3 of those 80s titles that really took a big role in developing characters. Now this was the birth. There was a lot of inspiration from mechas. The 70s were dominated by mecha shows. And so a lot of the robots that we'll see throughout the 80s were very much inspired by mechas. Mecha shows in general are very action-oriented. So Cyberpunk was like, we gotta be action-y. We gotta be like a mecha. And that kind of wrapped itself around to a lot of the shows, especially in the first half of the 80s. We don't see, especially in the first half, a lot of these big cities that we see in Ghost in the Shell. We'll start to see that with Bubblegum Crisis that kind of helps spawn that throughout the rest of Cyberpunk pretty much. We see a lot of societal rioting. We'll see that in Akira heavily. And darker environments, dark color palettes are almost the trend. But that wasn't the trend with our first show we're going to talk about today. And that's Megazone 2-3. So this came out in 1985. It was a 3/4-part series. And I say that because the third part, oftentimes when released, was actually released in part 3 and 4. So if you go look at the show later and someone says it's 4 parts, not that I'm wrong. It's just that this the last part kind of gets split. This follows, at least for part 1 and 2, Shogo Yahadi, who owns this governmental prototype motorcycle after his friend decided to test it out. Well, just like trying to own anything that's top secret in government, there's going to be a manhunt for it. You got to go track down this motorcycle. They need it. Well, in doing so, he uncovers a lot of the secrets that are hidden within Tokyo. Tokyo not being what meets the eye. Here, you start off with what looks like a normal action show, very much motorcycle chases, but it evolves into a lot of the technological way of society, conspiracies, and really the government controlling everything. It is a lot of the part very much mecha-esque, but it is in a cyberpunk setting and really the birth of it. And I'll show you in a few slides kind of what that really looks like. But part 1, it gave you a really good capturing of developing Shogo and kind of developing the setting around and seeing how it evolves and how it goes into this government type of conspiracy. What is Tokyo? Part 2 kind of took that away and made it a lot more of this government chase and a little bit darker. Part 3 and 4, it's a completely different story. New characters, new cast, new setting, in a completely different Tokyo, but it kept the themes of Megazone 2-3. So there was a weird thing that happened during Megazone 2-3 before I show you some of the animation stuff. They changed the animators after part 1, budget cuts. So they had to kind of rewrite what a lot of these characters look like. So if you do go watch it and you watch part 1 and part 2, and you go like, Mike, I thought part 2 was the same as part 1. It is the same characters. So kind of show you, at the beginning, Cyberpunks, on the left side in the middle picture, we see our 2 main characters. Shogo, which is all the way on the left, and Yui, which is the center character in the center image. Those are the 2 that we focus on most in Megazone 2-3. Well, we decided to go to part 2, and those 2 characters you see in the most prominent part of that right picture, those are our 2 main characters. They changed a lot, not because they decided to dye their hair and look a little different. No, they changed the animators. The character design is very different, and a lot of the shows you'll see within the 80s Cyberpunks either stopped because of budget cuts, had poor animation about halfway through, took a lot of animation liberties to keep the budget very low, because they didn't know if Cyberpunk was going to be a hit. They weren't sure. So they were kind of taking a try at this. And so a lot of these shows did not have a lot of money. They did not think that people were going to watch them. But they did, the last picture of part 2 was from a brand new animator. It was their first time ever doing character design. Well, they made a good name for themselves later, as Yasumi Yumetsu did the character designs for Lupin the Third, Dead or Alive, and eventually did a lot of endings and openings more recently with Gangsta and Dimension W, Dimension W being another Cyberpunk title. A lot of the people that worked on these went and did more Cyberpunk stuff, and we'll be talking about a lot of the people too as they carry through. Meanwhile, the character designer for the first part, that was Haruhiki Mikimoto. You may know from Macross, who also did the character designs for Habanera the Iron Fortress much later. So there was a lot of carryover. But the big part about Megazone 2.3 is this environmental aspect and kind of setting the stage of computers, supercomputers, and a technological society. The setting for much of the second half of part 1 is in this like supercomputer-esque Tokyo. You can see this kind of from the images that really show Tokyo, and it's very different than how you would picture it. Now this is all underground, this is kept secret from the rest of society. And through this whole motorcycle chase, that's kind of where they found each other. You'll see a lot of the Matrix, you can kind of tie into Megazone 2-3. A lot of the Matrix story, they use a lot of references and stuff from Megazone 2-3 into this. So this kind of started our Cyberpunks, but it really didn't, it only scratched the surface. The next one is a little bit more familiar type of style, where we have a leading character that's a cyborg. And in this case, a humanoid. The humanoid in 1986 was where we finally got really our first case of a robotic heroine. We don't really see that often until the 90s. This, directed by Shinichi Masaki of Initial D and Cardcaptor Sakura, allowed us to follow android Antoinette as she seeks to help Eric, the man that she loves, in order to stop the governor from destroying the planet and pretty much destroying Eric as well. Her quest was all about love. Now, she was very robotic. You can see kind of in this image that she was made to look very much like a robot. Very different than the designs we'll see in Battle Angel, that we'll see in Armitage the Third and Ghost in the Shell. But they wanted to kind of picture her as a human type of android, a humanoid. In the show, there's a big juxtaposition between her and other robots in the show that are very much more like mecha-based. You can see on that second picture at the top, that was the enemy robots. Very robotic, very not human. They want to juxtapose this idea of, can an android take over the emotions of a human? Now, throughout the show, all the characters are like, oh, Antoinette's not just a robot. She has no feelings, she has no personality, she's just a robot with one sole purpose, to do whatever we tell her. But when she sees Eric frolic in the water with his girlfriend, that becomes her. She wants to be like that. She wants to experience the smiles, the happiness, love. And it drives her through her actions as she tries to save Eric and save the planet that they're on. This kind of was this whole idea, and the OVA puts this as this last line. Who can say that a machine has no soul? Aren't humans machines too? Mechanisms of flesh and blood. This is kind of our instance of that quest for identity. Is it internal? Is it an internal quest? Do you find some kind of external fact that you need to bring in? The humanoid was a short, it wasn't highly publicized really in the US. You can find some copies out there. But they wanted to be big in the US. And in the 80s, what sci-fi was big? Star Wars. So when Japan ported over the humanoid, they thought, oh, we gotta be like Star Wars. They added an opening text crawl. That text crawl is not in the original Japanese version. It is only in the US release, because they wanted to tell you the story and lay out the plan before this whole entire show begins. It's like, oh, Star Wars did it. Star Wars made a lot of money. Star Wars was successful. Maybe we'll do that. See, it didn't work out so well for the humanoid. But it's still a great title. You can find a lot of copies out there. They're still out there, usually at secondhand places, at cons, or you can find them online. A lot of, pretty much I think most copies, if not all, are in VHS, but really good show. Anyway, let's go to the big titles. And then one of the first big titles of the 80s, Bubblegum Crisis. 1987 Bubblegum Crisis, an 8-part OVA that focused on the Night Sabers. It kind of continued a prior trend that we saw of this idea of computers and androids being the enemy. Now in the humanoid, we did see enemy androids, we saw enemy robots, but we did see friendly ones. Here we're looking at still our androids and robots being mostly the enemy versus what we'll see a little bit later in Cyberpunk history. But it does introduce a new type of villain here. And so we're still fleshing out the genre, but now we're taking one from Neuromancer and this idea of mega corporations. This became a big thread throughout Cyberpunk as corporations were considered evil for the most part. Now a big question that a lot of people ask about Bubblegum Crisis is, what the heck does that title mean? It's a little weird, a little outlandish, but when you analyze it from what writer Toshimichi Suzuki explained, it actually makes a lot of sense within both the genre of Cyberpunk and the show itself. The title is to reflect a world in crisis, kind of like a chewing gum bubble that is at full bubble. Is it going to burst? Is it going to deflate? Is it going to just stay there? You don't really know. And that's kind of where they're gathering. And it's a lot of the society that we see within Bubblegum Crisis, but we also see within a lot of the titles that we'll be talking about tonight. In addition, one of the big forces outside the Night Sabers, our main heroines, is the AD police. Another really important trope that we'll see, especially in a title a little bit later, Dominion Tank Police, is that the police are pretty incompetent due to red tape. They're supposed to handle the boomers, our robots. They don't. They're pretty bad. Low budget, political infighting, red tape, mainly low budget. And so it's up to the Night Sabers to really solve a lot of these. With a lot of the animation, we're still seeing that inspiration from mechas, and you'll see from the suits that the Night Sabers wear that they kind of look like mini mechas. They kind of look like mini Gundams. They kind of wanted to keep that still style there. They're not super human-like in some of their looks. They're still very sleek. We're starting to get towards that idea of separating Cyberpunk's design and mecha design. We're getting there. A lot of this setting, and you'll see it especially from that first picture over there, it's inspired by Blade Runner. You can compare a lot of the images of the city that we see in Bubblegum Crisis to what we see in Blade Runner. And it wanted to take a lot of the objects that we saw in Neuromancer and put it to the test. One of the big ones was right in that first episode, we see heavy mentions of disparities in both in wealth and society. And it's very much explained that it's worse than previous periods in Japan. This is a big, big thing that we want to focus on within this panel and seeing how that changes throughout Cyberpunk history. And that was a huge focus of Bubblegum Crisis. And it kind of made a lot of sense why the AD police were full of low budget and kind of not so great. Because there just wasn't the type of money that was available for a police squad. Because all the money was in these rich people that were drinking cocktails in their high-rises and corporations that were able to rule the world basically with their boomers or robots that control everything from delivering you your hamburger to cleaning your car to picking up your limo. Now, there was budget cuts, of course. Low budget and some fighting did not lead to Bubblegum Crisis really getting finished. We didn't get a resolution. They tried to. So there is another show that came out a few years later. The Bubblegum Crisis universe itself is one of the largest in Cyberpunk's, second really only to Ghost in the Shell. And that was Bubblegum Crash. Bubblegum Crash came out a few years later. It was a sequel. They tried to wrap up the story of Bubblegum Crisis because they said, wait, we need to put a finish on this. We didn't finish it the first time, so let's go do it. It didn't really finish what the story was. There was a reimagining, Bubblegum Crisis Tokyo 2040, a few years later, that kind of updated the animation style, updated the story, changed a few things that tried to be a good reimagining of the story. And we did see other spawns, big titles like AD Police and Parasite Dolls, much later in the 90s and early 2000s, that kept this trend going and kept the Bubblegum Crisis universe going on. Another interesting fact about Bubblegum Crisis, the influence of Cyberpunk doesn't just always stay in Cyberpunk. There was the idea, especially with the 80 Police Squad and the Night Sabers, they were like, oh, it's kind of like a harem. It's not. But that's what people thought, and so it became kind of an inspiration for Tenchi Muyo, which is very different than Bubblegum Crisis, but there was a lot of inspiration drawn from it. It does show kind of how even early cyberpunks did influence outside of their genre. Bubblegum Crisis is often cited as one of the top 5 cyberpunks of all time. Its influences abound, especially where it really helped propel the cityscapes that we saw in Blade Runner into a lot of other anime titles that we'll be seeing, and even some that we don't talk about today. Moving forward, we wouldn't be here in this panel, we wouldn't be sitting in this room if it wasn't really for one guy. And as we move through the 80s, this is where he gets his start. And that's Masamu Nishio. He is basically the father of cyberpunk in Japan. A lot of the best titles ever, a lot of the most influential titles ever, you can go to him. Now, his actual name is Masanori Oda. What he looks like, that is one of the few pictures of him, and it's still disputed if that is actually him. He is a recluse. He does not show his face often. Many times, interviewers, the few that get a chance to interview him, they don't know what he looks like until they actually walk in the room and interview him, if they see him at all. He likes to stay hidden, and he's always kind of stayed hidden throughout his career. Now, he debuted in 1983 with a manga, Black Magic, which eventually became an anime as well, Black Magic M66. And that was 2 years before his best-selling manga, Appleseed, which is the next title that we'll be talking about. But he kind of made sure that we kept this sci-fi-esque cyberpunks. He wanted to bring in that dystopian environment. And we see that heavily in Ghost in the Shell. We see that heavily in Black Magic MC66. We see that mostly in Appleseed. That became kind of an inspiration outside of cyberpunk, with titles like Attack on Titan, Darling in the Franxx, and Steins Gate. Now, he wasn't just into a lot of cyberpunks. He also was a big believer in insects. We'll talk about Ghost in the Shell later, and one of the big things in Ghost in the Shell are the Tachikomos and Fuchikomos, which are the big robots. They kind of look like little spiders walking around. He did that because he really likes insects. Not just because he thought it would be a cool design, but he wanted to bring his type of other passions into anime. So we'll start off first with Appleseed in 1988. This OVA adapted from his manga. It's set in World War III in this utopian city, surrounded by a dystopia. For Shiro, he said, it's very much like Tokyo. This city takes humans, those who are on the outside, and bioroids, these genetically engineered people created for a purpose, and kind of throws them into the city with a bunch of cyborgs. But there's a lot of discrimination between our different groups, a lot of hatred between them. They don't really get along, and most of that's fueled from the government. Now, the OVA that we're going to be talking to, while it did adapt from the manga, it differs greatly from the manga. So if you do read the manga and you watch the OVA, they're going to be very different. Really, the only thing that carried over were the characters and the characters' names. But like the manga that Shiro wrote, this merges this idea of cyberpunk and mecha, and brings in a lot of ideas of politics, philosophy, sociology. This OVA itself dives a lot into deep, deep topics, especially those of, are you stuck in a cage? Are you the caged bird, or are you the one that's going to fly free? And before we go right into the a fun fact about Appleseed that I enjoy is late Robin Williams was a huge Appleseed fan. He talked about it at length, and this was one of his favorite titles. If you do look into Appleseed, there are a bunch of other versions of it. There were a lot of films that came after, especially in the 2000s and 2010s. Appleseed the film, Appleseed Ex Machina, Appleseed Alpha, and Appleseed 13. The first two, Appleseed and Ex Machina, they're kind of tied together, a first film and a sequel. And then Appleseed Alpha is kind of its own thing, a little bit predates before all the titles. And then if you really did want to kind of have an adaptation of the manga, if you read the manga and you really wanted to see it in full motion, Appleseed 13 is that adaptation. Anyway, back to the show. So this show took this whole idea about utopia versus dystopia and really threw it at us. This idea is, do you want to live in this beautiful utopia that's surrounded by a cage and your whole life is faked and you get to have as many genetically engineered traits as you want? You could be a superhuman, basically. Or do you want to live in this horrible dystopia where humans have personalities and emotions? They're not even created by a computer. Yeah, I guess the latter really sucks. But that was kind of the driving force behind our villain here, AJ Sebastian, who wanted to show people that, hey, this dystopian society is not all that bad, that we should have emotions, and that should be really the driving force behind us. We want to have emotions, we want to have feelings, we shouldn't just be listening to what a computer told us that we need to do. Olympus here, which is the large image on the left, is very much like a cage. There's a fake sky, a dome that they're building in a place that looks very much like ancient Greece. It seems perfect. It looks perfect. But instead it's filled with a lot of discrimination and a lot of this whole dispute between humans and bioroids. And almost all that's fueled by the government. The higher-ups in society, this governmental play that we see within the cyberpunks kind of really fuses itself here as it leads to a lot of fighting. This OVA gave us a little bit of a twist on what we've seen before. Our main characters here are part of the discriminated society. They're trying to fight back. They don't always want to fight back, but they try, and that's kind of where we pick up the story. At many times, they're thought to be the terrorists, even though they're trying to actually catch the terrorists. Here, this world's ravaged by war. It's considered outside the city to be unsafe, horrible, that those that live outside the city are lesser than everyone else. They're no longer human. They no longer belong out there. All of that was driven by government propaganda that was kind of driving people to increase this piece. But the city wasn't supposed to be a dystopia. This dystopia, it was supposed to be peaceful. It was supposed to be beautiful. This is where that metaphor comes in. Like I said, it's a cage. The opening scene is exactly a bird flying out of the cage and kind of shows you that, hey, this is really where we live. This is where Olympus is. This helped launch a huge movement in Cyberpunk. I call it the Appleseed movement. And this motion towards kind of diving into these dystopian societies that are really locked in. Everything seems shiny and peaceful, but in reality, it's not at all. We also see it often now, right from this point onward, especially in the 90s, that the cyborgs and androids are no longer the enemies. They're now starting to be our allies. They can be human. But they wanted to kind of start, we see that motion start driving itself. And that will be kind of the set stage for what we'll see in the 90s. Now before we wrap up the 80s, we have two more shows really that help propel. One is a comedy of sorts, Dominion Tank Police. Very different. And I told you at the beginning, we're going to talk about a lot of revolutionary things that buck the norm, and Dominion Tank Police did just that. It made you laugh. It is another title by Masamune Shirow. It is nothing like his other shows. They're both very dark. This one makes you want to laugh. A lot of gags, a lot of humor, a lot of fun characters. But it still played some of the roles that we do see in a lot of the tropes. Now the first one, it's a normal little terrorist chase between Byaku in the middle and our cat sisters. But the second part is where we dive into a little bit deeper and go back to that idea of identity. As Byaku, who's our antagonist, is trying to find his birth certificate because he wants to learn about his past. He doesn't know where he's from, what his past is. He's just like, I steal things and I do jobs for other villains and whatnot. But now we want to kind of learn what he is and where he kind of came from. Now, as I said, it is a comedy. It's really quirky. It's very different than what we'll be talking about throughout a lot of shows we already talked about. If you do get a chance to watch, there's a lot of fun characters. Leona, our main character, all the way on the left top corner, she's in love with her tank. So much so that she is completely oblivious to a lot of the moves that her partner puts on her. Or Captain Brendan, the picture close to me on the top, he thinks that a tank should be treated like a brother. He is like a Hulk Hogan type of character. He's a lot of fun, but he thinks that there's nothing better than a tank, and you gotta take care of your tank. And then unfortunately, I couldn't find a good picture of him, but my personal favorite character, the chaplain, or as I like to call him, Ned Flanders. Looks just like Ned Flanders, mustache and all, and makes a lot of jokes until he's like, yeah, throw the knives at him. I don't think Ned Flanders is going to see saying that anytime soon. But the show is a lot silly. The characters are slapstick humor, rich and full of personality. We're not going to say that often tonight about a lot of shows. But it did bring in a lot of the things that we talked about with regards to the environment. In this cyberpunk, we do see the environment is ecologically destroyed. To go outside, you kind of had to wear a mask because of the amount of smog that was there. You really want to stay in your tank or your car. A lot of the buildings are just overgrown with disaster. It's a very artificial looking city. It does not seem very normal, even though the characters themselves are just very playful. But the idea here is that it places a way that while we are laughing about it, it is still that quest for who are you. It has a lot of political conflicts, infighting, cover-ups, corruption, and while it might not be the most well-known of Shiro's works, it did make probably one of the greatest lists of anime out there, and that's 500 Essential Anime Movies from Helen MacArthur, one of the great historians of anime. And says that this is basically this serious type of show, but it's wrapped up in a nice, funny, light, shiny package of action, slapstick, and puns. It was different, and it is very different from the next film that we're going to talk about, that also was on that list, Akira. So we go from humor to the exact opposite of humor. Written by Katsuhiro Otomo, who's done a lot of other cyberpunk outside of Akira. Neo Tokyo is perhaps one of his other finest works outside of Akira. This depicts a dystopian Tokyo in the really far-off year of 2019. We got our teenage biker Tetsuyo. He's captured by the government due to his psychic powers. We see his friend Kaneda trying to save him and trying to save Tokyo from another attack. For being wiped out again. Because, you know, they have to host the Olympic Games in, well, and oddly enough, well, the Olympics were hosted in Tokyo. Technically 2021, the 2020 Olympics, but it was always, the joke was made that, oh great, we're going to have an Akira attack because the Olympics we talked about are happening in Tokyo the same year. As far as I know, we didn't, but the Olympics still happened and Tokyo is still standing. Anyway, this kind of took a different move and tried to use psychic powers to delve into a lot of different problems in the government. It took a different type of play and brought in a few different ways. We didn't see psychic powers in any of the other shows in the 80s in the cyberpunk genre. So it was like, yeah, we're going to do something a little bit fresh. So one of the big things that I love talking about Akira, and we can dissect Akira all day long. It can be a whole 5-hour panel, weekend-long discussion. But some of the big things I'm going to bring up are kind of the environment that we see. This juxtaposition between the city and the outskirts. This juxtaposition between this built-up, beautiful, shiny, lovely new Tokyo, Neo-Tokyo as they called it, and the junkyards, the destruction, graffiti all over the place, not built up, not looking like very futuristic. It looks like completely different cities when you look at that top picture and bottom picture on the left. And here they wanted to really depict the societal differences, and that was a lot of heavy things in Akira, was these societal differences. We saw often rioting and we saw protests within Akira, and that is one of the big themes. So throughout Akira, we're trying to basically stop another destruction of Tokyo. And when we see these riots, we see this collapse of outside this developed area, actually the film is trying to tell us that destruction, whether man-made, whether natural, it's an inevitable cycle. No matter what, we're going to see destruction. No matter what we do, we're going to lead that way to where it is. Whether it's small destruction, whether it's physical destruction, emotional, whatever it is, it's going to be there. An economical destruction, which we see a lot in cyberpunks. This new Neo-Tokyo society, Otomo wanted to resemble as close to as possible what we see in Tokyo, well, then, today, at least back in '88. And he wanted to show this city that was built up with social unrest, that was about to burst, that was about to destroy itself from the inside, whether it's revolts, whether it's riots. But he didn't want that to really be the big story. He wanted you to see that, but still be on this line of our main characters. So, for the sake of time and not sitting here and going on and on about Akira, which I can do for a whole time, I want you to go and rewatch this again. And I want you to focus on actually one of the last lines of the film. I am Tetsuo. Once again, now that you know that the end of the film, you can go back and kind of think about what Tetsuo went through. The emotional highs, the changes, the challenges, trying to find himself. Ring a bell from that first thing I talked about early on? Even here we see this quest for identity, and that kind of captured a lot of what these early cyberpunks really try to tell without being super blatant. The 90s, they're going to be a lot more blatant about this. So moving into the 90s, this was where we started to see the rise of these android personalities. We saw it with the humanoid to start. We're going to see it a lot with Battle Angel. We'll see it a lot with Armitage III, and we will see it a lot within the Ghost in the Shell universe. We will also move away from mechas. We'll move more into what we really know as a cyberpunk. And we'll start to see a lot more of the psychological titles out there. A little bit less of the action, and that kind of was tied to that moving away from the mecha genre. So we'll start off in '93 with Battle Angel. It's going to be very similar to the couple shows that are going to follow it with Armitage III and Ghost in the Shell. And here we follow a cyborg main character that's just trying to live a normal life as much as possible. Based on the manga by Yukito Kishira, who would work on a lot more Battle Angel Alita throughout the career, that started when they were 17 in 1984. This was one of the pinnacle pieces of Kishiro's career. Now the OVA, if you do watch it, did change a lot of the names, and depending upon if you watch the original Japanese version or the Viz version, you'll hear a lot of different things, such as Galley instead of Alita, depending upon what version you watch. It's often regarded as one of the crisper animes that was ever brought over to America. It was not as successful over Japan as it was here, but it was a very high-budget dub and a very high-budget produced OVA when they came over to the US. Now, it was only just 32 minutes and 2 episodes, each of 32 minutes. So it was very short, but it became one of those pinnacle works of the 90s, and we see its inspiration today as we got the Battle Angel Alita live-action film just a few years ago. Here we follow our main character. Again, it was a Galley or Alita in the manga and Viz Media edition that came over here in this cyberpunk world. This society is built up with 3 parts. A utopian city that hangs above us, that floats above the world. We see factories that are manned by cyborgs, and we see the scrapyard where we kind of start our journey. That's where we first meet Alita, and we meet Dr. Ito. This society, it's filled with decay, it's filled with corruption, it's filled with greed, inequality, a lot of the dark parts. And then we got Alita, who is literally the exact opposite of that most of the time. Trying to be very bubbly, trying to be this hope character, very full of emotion, full of humanity, full of personality, and this juxtaposition that in a world of dystopia, it's that one robot that's able to lift us up and give us hope, while all these people are living down here hoping for one day for them to venture up and be able to be part of this utopian society. Another big part of Alita was this introduction that humans and androids can have a very familiar relationship. Often we might only see it as partners and fighting crime and things like that. But now we start to see them become kind of a family, and that was where we saw with Dr. Vito and Alita, this whole father-daughter type of relationship. That you can start to treat these robots and androids as if they are human, as if they do have these personalities. And we'll see that coexist a lot throughout many titles. Next up on our awesome heroine through Cyberpunk is Armitage III in 1995. This was written by Chiaki J. Konaka, who will be known later for serial experiments Lane, as well as Digimon Tamers, and was heavily influenced by the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Armitage III is, again, this chase for identity, as Naomi Armitage tries to find out who she is. We open up Armitage III in a world where Earth has been overpopulated and overrun. So mankind says, we gotta go to other planets. Mars being the location of our OVA here. Here we follow our detective Ross Syllabus as he lands on Mars to join the Martian Police Department, only to find out that the last country singer in the universe was just killed in the airport. Oh man, we're losing country music. Oh well. Now, that country singer that everyone thought was a human turned out to be an android. A Type 3 android, just like Armitage. And so this quest is that Armitage wants to find out who's hunting all these Type 3 androids down. One, she wants to survive. But find out who's hunting them down, but also find out why she was created. What's her purpose in life? Why is she here? What is she supposed to do? This show deals a lot with the idea of android rights, and we see a lot of times that androids were put down. We see a lot of racism towards androids from the humans that think androids are going to steal all of their jobs. It was kind of a driving factor with our antagonist here. A lot of earlier cyberpunks were man versus machine. Well, we finally got the other way around, where we have a machine that's really fighting society, that's fighting the humans. Here the society is very, very advanced. Androids are finally almost human-like. Juxtapose that with Antoinette and the humanoid, we see a very different style, almost indistinguishable. And that was kind of to show that, hey, yeah, they're a robot, but they can just be like us. They can just be humans. You don't need to necessarily know the difference between them. And they can serve this purpose. That was what Armitage was searching for. What was her purpose? She had a lot of personality. She was putting her feet up on cars, acting all rebel-like, but she was also very serious. So she showed a lot of human emotion, and then a lot of what that steel cold type of thing that a lot of people paint androids to be. This probably would have been the top show of the 90s if it wasn't overshadowed by a very similar film just a few months later with a fully cybernetic main female lead. What do you think that was? Ghost in the Shell. Probably the most influential and well-known cyberpunk anime ever. Ghost in the Shell with Matt that was shown from the original manga by Masamune Shirow has spawned a huge, huge genre. More films, more TV shows, video games. It is a huge universe in the Ghost in the Shell. And that started really when we got to anime with this 95 film. It's exploded. But we want to focus just on this 95 film first, and we'll talk about Standalone Complex from the 2000s later. But this takes place in 2029 and details Major Kusanagi and the Public Security Sector 9's case about the Puppet Master. This was from the great director Mamoru Oshii, who went on to add a lot of his personal experiences to it. Mainly his experience with computers, and how they just seem so foreign, so much more advanced than what society was at that time. Here in Ghost in the Shell, we talk a lot about cybernetics and whether or not cybernetics have a place in humanity. Into what can cybernetics do for yourself, and whether or not with these cybernetics you're still what you were when you were a human, or when you were fully flesh. A lot of juxtapositions between those that are fully human and those that are pretty much fully cybernetic. We first really see in this 95 Ghost in the Shell and become a lot more explicit as we go through Standalone Complex and Ghost in the Shell Rise. We'll talk a lot more about that when we get to Standalone Complex as we kind of dissect the different ways that we see. But this kind of set the idea, and combining it with Armitage III, Battle Angel, a lot of these non-male leads ruling over the cyberpunk world. They were able to dominate the show. They didn't need partners. They were that character that dominated screen time, dominated the story, and were kind of fully entrenched into who they are and what they wanted to do. Ghost in the Shell's influence outside of its own universe is abound. Whether it is with The Matrix, which took a lot of inspiration from Ghost in the Shell and the look of Ghost in the Shell, to even the Avatar film and AI artificial intelligence Spielberg's film. As for the environment of Ghost in the Shell, we see in the middle of the film a great little montage that goes off in the last couple minutes, for a couple minutes, of just going to surround the city. A big juxtaposition from seeing Motoko and seeing the actions that are undertaken, the thoughts, instead to a soundtrack of the song, just looking at images of the city. Airplanes flying by, ships, cleaning trucks going through, people walking through the rain. This idea that society keeps on moving, keeps on going, no matter how much more advanced that we get. The final thing that it asks is, what does it mean to be human? And this is a huge question that Motoko Kusanagi asks herself, and a question that really doesn't get answered in here, but it will get answered a lot in Standalone Complex. We will see this as a staple of cyberpunk anime for years and years to come. And without Ghost in the Shell, another reason why we're here today in this panel is Ghost in the Shell. For many, it inspired people to watch cyberpunk anime. It was one of their first titles or their favorite title. It asked a lot of great questions. And it showed that cyberpunk is not profitable, but successful. People want to watch it, and it helped spawn a lot of titles that happened in the late 90s and throughout the 2000s. And one of those, which kind of also jumped on the success of Armitage III, because if that wasn't successful, Jackie Konako would not have gotten this next title to finish out the 90s, Serial Experiments Lane. This 98 piece is one of the other pinnacle titles of cyberpunk, especially in the 90s. And this was about the internet revolution. We're approaching Y2K, so let's get a Y2K style show that focuses on Lane, who wasn't very computer savvy or internet savvy, that gets dived into the world of virtual reality and the world of the internet. Wanting to work on computers, always be surrounded by computers, diving into this world of the wired. We see Ghost in the Shell kind of touches a little bit upon jumping into cyberspace, but this is where we kind of get that big jump with Serial Experiments Lane and seeing this alternative cyber world, as she starts to live a lot more in the world of wired than she does in her own reality. Going from this, I don't care about computers, to I want everything possible with a computer. We see a lot of these images that her room throughout the series develops from a really cute little room with a bunch of stuffed animals on the window and kind of empty to what almost looks like a server room. As she dark and light. It kind of looks like a computer screen. That was the inspiration here with Serial Experiments Lane. Makes it like you're watching kind of a computer at night. You have all the lights off in your room, your computer's on, it is bright, it is shining that light. That's what Serial Experiments Lane tried to depict in a lot of its imagery. It wanted to show that, hey, there's connections through technology, there's connections through the internet, there's connections through meeting people and embracing society and communications through technology. But there is also the whole humanity aspect of there are important connections that you can make and very important decisions that you will have to make by being in person. That technology is not always the end-all, be-all of what communication is and what society is. We see a lot of these street lights and street wires keep showing up. We see as the series progresses, the world of the wires starts to fuse a little bit more with reality. It invades kind of almost like a computer virus. That the more you get sucked into phones and internet, and very much like what today is, where a lot of people have their nose in their phone and stuff, you kind of get sucked into phones and you lose track of what's around you. Here, as Lane loses track of what's around her, the reality and the internet become kind of one. This is another title that we can sit here and dive into and really break down. It's a great title that I said. But before we move to the 2000s, I'll leave you with one of the most adorable pictures of cyberpunk history. Lane in a barrel. So into the 2000s we go, the century, we finally meet the century mark. We're past Y2K, we're starting to embrace technology. Technology has to speed up a little bit in cyberpunk because now reality is starting to embrace technology. Still very early, we're still far from a lot of the worlds depicted in early cyberpunks. But now we start to see the rise of computers and households and the original mobile phones, and soon eventually these things that look like they're taken out of a cyberpunk. And we're branching them out, and now cyberpunk shows need to be a little bit more creative in what they're doing. We'll see a lot of worldwide societal issues tackled with these titles. A lot more far-reaching and far-branching with what it does and what we learn. We'll dial back to start with Ghost in the Shell standalone complex. This continuation of our Ghost in the Shell universe. Kind of a little more complex throughout than our 95 film, touching on a lot of different topics. Directed by Kenji Kamiyama, who loved Mamoru Oshii's work. It was something that he was so excited to be able to work on. So in 2002, with Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, we see 2 seasons of Motoko. The first focusing on the Laughing Man, a mystery master hacker that can hack into cyber brains at just about any time. And then we see the terrorist Hideo Kuze, who you'll see as a character in the 2017 live-action adaptation. We'll also see this film, Solid State Society, which is kind of a retelling of the 95 film as part of standalone complex. Now, compared to what we saw in the 95 film, this was one of our first pieces of post-cyberpunk, where the world is less focused on that dystopia, a little bit more familiar to what we see, and seeing the technology being a lot more integrated to everything that we do. Again, a lot more like what we're seeing. One of the most important parts here is this idea of deep diving, which we saw in Serial Experiments Lane, and we pushed forward very much so in standalone complex. So I want to start with kind of this whole idea the series starts with. One of the first lines of the series talks about this idea of coalescing. That standalone individuals that have not been converted into data, they can become one to a unique component of a huge, large complex. That we can all band together and be stronger, we can be one. And that kind of was this whole focus, especially towards that first season of we're stronger if we are together. So first we'll touch upon these Tachikomas, which embody that. We're stronger when we're together. They work as a team. They talk as a team. They got a lot of personality as a team. These Tachikomas, which were inspired by the spiders that Shiro loved, they have these ideas of, while they're very robot-like, each have their own personalities, and we see growth throughout the first season, this idea they're able to think for themselves, a robot thinking for themselves, which Motoko was not very happy about because they were, being able to self-sacrifice or worried that they might die in fighting and helping somebody. So she's like, no, we can't have you guys have personality. Got you to just be robots, even though she had a lot of personality herself. But still they fight through that, they find who they are, and they are an embodiment of identity within standalone complex. We see this question touched upon a lot in the 95 film from Motoko, but not so much from other characters. But now in Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, we see that branching out to a lot of different characters, especially with the Tachikomas. We also see these ideas towards the latter half of the first season, a library scene. And I won't spoil the whole entire scene for you, but this idea of reality versus what's in your mind, and whether your subconscious helps you create what you want or what you desire while you're trying to find who you are. One of the last things we'll talk about before diving into some characters from this is the environment. The cities that we see in Standalone Complex are very different than what we saw in the 95 film, and very different than what we saw in a lot of 80s and 90s cyberpunk. Again, they want to be very familiar to society. So while we do see sprawling cities, we see nice little areas of grass and small developments. It looks actually pretty nice. But there is some disaster. There is some of that Blade Runner-esque, really tall high-rises and bright colors, wires, electricity flowing through the city. But you get this point where, while it is in a destroyed Tokyo, one after World War III, after the nuclear disaster, decay is not part of this. It's and recover. Very different and distinct from what the 95 film brought to the table. Our last topic, and kind of one of the deepest ones that we'll talk about throughout this whole panel, but especially with Standalone Complex, is this idea of Motoko and who she is, and these ideas of femininity, sexuality, and what her identity is. So Shiro's original manga, and Shiro drew a lot from, as kind of a hentai artist, drew a lot from that into the manga, and made her very sexual and very feminine. But that was not taken to the 95 film. The 95 film kind of pulled that away, and we see that really reflected as well in 2017 live action, which kind of tries these questions that we see of who she is, what she and what she's trying to find. What is her identity and what she believes in. We see that change a lot as we move into Standalone Complex, that middle image there, and especially so with Arise, which came out in the 2010s, where we see her kind of change who she is, well, not change who she is, but discover who she is, and really we dive more into her becoming the major Kusanagi that we know. Through different stories, different tales, different ways that she went through life, and this kind of helped capture her as she tries to figure out, is this really my body? Is this really where I belong? Is this really a shell that I should be in? And trying to figure things out. It is an interesting tale of becoming one with oneself, becoming one with the environment and that they're around, becoming one with the challenges and labors that life throws at you. So we'll move forward through the 2000s to Corral Phantom Memory, another post-cyberpunk, towards really the end of the spectrum of post-cyberpunk. And here we see Corral, our title character, having these psychic supernatural powers, or really they're alien powers, with her and her partner, Christmas. But the goal here is that they just want to live a normal life. But since they got powers and they have stuff they're dealing with, they're tracked down by the government, and they're trying to escape these governments that want to capture them and use their powers to energize the world, basically. They wanted to find new energy, and they thought these powerful girls would be the secret to that, as well as other beings, renacts of beings that are invaded with this alien technology. You'll see a lot of these early episodes very reminiscent of the scenes that we see in Ghost in the Shell. But then we see a lot of scenes that are very different and very non-cyberpunk, very more grass and peaceful as we explore a lot of Europe and kind of go to cities that are vastly different than the ones we depict in things like formula. Armitage the Third is a very similar title to this. You'll see a lot of similarities between the two, where it's this chase for trying to do things for the one that you love, and trying to have this relationship but being stopped because the government's trying to capture it. It is a very well fleshed out title, but it took a very different approach to cyberpunks than a lot of other titles have. it focused a lot less on necessarily the technology, but more on the other aspects of cyberpunk, especially the social disparities, discrimination, disaster, and this trying to overcome a lot of the tarnished world. I strongly recommend this title just from its a lot of the unpacking that you can do with it. It is a really well fleshed out title. But like I said, the environment's very different than what we saw in a lot of the ones that we talked about already. This, you're not going to be confusing this with Blade Runner anytime soon. It's very different because it wanted to say that, hey, a post-cyberpunk world does not have to be far off in the future. It can look like any city that we go to, any town that we're in. We could be living in one, just there. The show wants you to draw emotion. The show wants you to see different characters, their personalities, their perspectives, and that they're not too far off from what you experience throughout your daily lives. Unfortunately, it didn't really get a lot of popularity in the 2000s. Most of it was due to Funimation's marketing of it. They marketed it as a kick-butt type of action show. Well, most of the kick-butt action is in the first 2 episodes. The rest of the episodes, not so much. And so it kind of floundered because people were expecting a big action show, and it toned down that a lot, and they were like, oh, I'm bored of this. But if you go in with a different perspective, and you go in trying to dive into the people, the characters there, it takes a very different tone for the show. 2006, we had Ergo Proxy, my all-time favorite cyberpunk title. Written by Guy Saito, who worked on Cowboy Bebop, Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, Wolf's Reign, and Eureka 7. This was a really awesome take on utopia versus dystopia. It focused on these dome cities, one of them Rondo, where our story begins, and the environmental world that's set to be destroyed. You can't live out there. You can only live in these dome cities that are perfect for you. They have everything you need. Why would you go outside? But when we see this story begin, we see a lot of the robots, these androids or auto raves that are supposed to help people. They're going crazy. They're going haywire with this cogito virus. No, they're not causing mass destruction. No. They're getting personality. And we can't have that in this society. They're just supposed to do what they're told. They're self-aware. They know what they need to do. They're thinking for themselves. And while the government and a lot of the characters in here make that seem like it's a super bad thing, we explore from the perspective of 3 of our characters, Riel, Vincent, and Pino, who is an auto rave. Kind of this whole idea of this cogito virus, why it's happening, why are auto raves getting personalities, and then what are proxies, these beings, these creatures, these whatever they are, that just pop out of nowhere and they say, oh, they cause destruction. They must be the reason that all these androids are self-aware. As Riel kind of dives into this world, she discovers a lot of things that are being kept from her. A lot of questions she can't answer. To her, the dome cities are told to be the sacred place, don't go outside. That's what she was talking about when she was young and as she goes through. But by the time we get to the show, it's time for her to venture out and see the world for herself. Go to other domes and see why we can't venture into the unknown. Riel tries to explore a lot of questions and get answers. Very headstrong for this. Vincent, meanwhile, he wants to know why he's having these flashes and these flashbacks of this weird proxy guy talking to him and kind of where he came from. And he has a lot of questions about his own personality and his own identity. Meanwhile, Pino, who is this adorable character in the bottom corner, one of the cutest characters in all of anime, if I can say so myself, she is an auto rave, presumably infected with this cogito virus that is a nice sense of humor and brightness in a very dark world. But we explore that how auto raves are able to help people. In what ways can they help? In what ways can our androids help us? And this exploration that humans and androids working together can accomplish a lot more. This is kind of where there's this balance between societies, this balance between humans and androids. Ergo Proxy puts that so well into perspective. There's not much difference between the two. Can you really have a difference between the two? This post-apocalyptic, post-cyberpunk title brings that out so prevalently And we see that depicted in the different environments we see, the bright dome cities, the dark outside, and even some cities that change themselves. One might be this utopian super cyberpunk society, another a grassy meadows, one that's a game show. That's a pretty cool place to live, by the way. So the psychological nature of the show depicts that worlds can be different, this idea of what we care about, what we love can be different, and that your journey is defined by yourself. So as you go through different worlds, different trials, different types of environments, everything that you go through, all the adventures, all the quests, that helps define who you are. We'll head on over to 2008 with a little lesser known title from Production IG, which does a lot of cyberpunk titles as a studio. That's Real Drive. We'll talk about it in a little bit of a glancing manner, but Real Drive is a diving anime. Like actual diving in an ocean, not just diving into cyberspace. Cyberspace and the ocean are one and the same in this show. It focuses on this world where now 50 years in the future from this diver's perspective, the world and the secret of the sea are still to be uncovered. The sea, which is how people connect with one another in a new fashion, very similar to how Lane connected with others through The Wire. They are able to dive in the ocean and experience this virtual reality, this new world. It goes into the human psyche. It dives into personality. It dives into what makes up human. They don't really know this all that much until they start diving and they see this psychological world, this world that really awakens them. So this world set off in the far future of 2061 is this idea of human consciousness can be linked together. This is a theme that goes throughout a lot of other titles, and Kisniver most recently is one like that, where human consciousness and human feelings can be linked together throughout the world. These ideas here are that everything is connected, that no matter what you do, and especially in a world of technology where really everything is connected and everyone is connected, we're able to bring things along. Unfortunately, this title was never brought over to the US, so you really can't capture any viewership of it, but hopefully one day someone will pick it up, license it, and bring it over here. But this title captures a lot of the ideas behind going into and working with other people and trying to figure out what makes them work, what are differences between different types of people and different types of works. It is a piece by Masamune Shiro. It is one of Shiro's only works that we did not get over here. But hopefully one day we'll finally bring this piece over. While Shiro was the father of Cyberpunk, there was another guy that really helped propel Cyberpunk in a different direction in the 2000s, and that's Yasuhiro Yoshiro. Probably the biggest title for a long time for him was Time of Eve, which is the next one we'll be talking about. And most recently, Sing a Bit of Harmony, which was an award-nominated film, I believe last year, for it. He brings together this world of mecha, this world of cyberpunk, a world of slice of life, and this society that everything is intertwined, everything is very deep and rich, but he also has very simple concepts in a lot of these, and that simple experiences can really impact a lot of people. And that goes to one of our slice of life titles I call Time of Eve. This came out in 2008. This was an ONA by Yoshiro. And this focuses on a cafe in Time of Eve, where there's one rule. Androids and humans, there's no discrimination. They're all one and the same. This world in Time of Eve, androids, like the one on the left, they have to be identified out in the open with a little halo above their head, so people know that they're an android. There's a lot of discrimination between humans and androids. Humans put down the androids. They think that they're lesser. But in Time of Eve, in the cafe, can't do that. The androids have to turn off their halo. So this beautiful cafe backdrop is where our story takes place, where our main characters waltz in because they're trying to figure out why their household android keeps wandering off some location during the day. And they wander into this cafe. Now here, there's no difference. Everyone is treated the same. That is their number one rule. But of course, our main characters are like, we want to figure out who's the android here, who's the human, and through this series they talk to a bunch of different people, or androids, we don't know, trying to see who it is and why they come to this cafe. There's a lot of different types of characters that they meet. Some are very robotic, like the one in the top left, but you gotta treat him just like a human. Now he looks like a tin can. He has smoke coming out of his ears, his mouth, and everywhere else, and he's about to break down full of oil. But you gotta treat him like a human. There's other ones that are indistinguishable. That's what the whole entire idea of Time of Eve is. That there's not much of a difference because we all have our own personalities, we all have our own feelings and emotions and stories. Here we get to hear a lot of the stories of our characters throughout this show. Each character that we talk to throughout, we get to hear their tales. Especially in a world where there's a lot of anti-android, a lot of anti-wanting to be that. This idea that androids shouldn't exist. One of the big ads, the one with the tomato, is run by the ethics committee. That is like, oh, if you like androids, well guess what? Soon our food's gonna be androids. Look at this tomato. It's not made of tomato. It's just a bunch of gears and bolts. Now, once again, we're looking at a show that tries to divide society, divide humans, divide androids, put a wedge between them. But our characters learn throughout this that that's not really where it is. That androids are a lot closer to humans than you think, and as long as we don't have that if we take away that marker on their head, we're all one and the same. We all have these same emotions, these same experiences that join us together. Like I said, this is kind of a slice of life, so it's a little bit different than a lot of the titles we'll talk about today. Very less action-y oriented, and a lot more quaint, peaceful. It's a really cool 6-episode O&A. You can find it on Crunchyroll, both separated as 6 episodes, but also made to piece together as one film. So moving on to the 2010s, the modern times for a lot of cyberpunks. It tried to return to a little bit more of a darker feel. It tried to be a little more universal, tried to be a lot more popular. It wanted to branch out. You'll see a lot of titles really broke through the barrier of being on the outskirts of anime to being one of the most portable anime that you're going to see a lot of merch and whatnot in the exhibitors' halls. The first one of those, Psycho Pass. Probably one of the most popular and successful cyberpunk animes in the last decade. This one was inspired a lot by LA Confidential, Minority Report, Gattaca, Brazil, and of course, Blade Runner. Psycho Pass is meant to represent the world of cyberpunk from a humanity standpoint, rather than dealing with what technology and computers and stuff can deal with. Instead, it's looking at our interaction with artificial intelligence, and whether the idea of an AI can kind of read into who we are as a human and can tell us whether we have a good psyche or a bad psyche, all because a robot tells us, or in this case, a robotic gun. This society and the psychological themes deals with stress, it deals with connections to crime, it deals with this idea of the civil system that can judge people based on how likely they're going to commit a crime. It prejudges people before crimes are made because it wants to keep society safe. But can an AI, can a computer really judge us? Can a computer really tell us who we are? Is it right? So while our focus is on this aspect of this AI controlling this whole entire society structure, we see our characters, some that have good psychopasses and some that are considered possible criminals or actual criminals. And this idea that they're all fighting for the same cause, they're all trying to live their lives, they're all trying to go about their times, finding happiness, finding joy, what makes them tick. You really can't tell too much of the difference between them. And that's where our main character, Tsunemori, comes in thinking that those that have high psychopasses are all bad, all the enemy. But comes to learn that a lot of them are just like you and me, just like any other character, just like anyone else, and that their role in society gets to be kind of determined by this AI, and whether or not computers should be the ones that tell us where we go and what that role is. This is kind of a return to the idea of man versus machine, but the machine is the unseen villain. You don't see it, you just know that it's out there, that's telling you what you can and can't do. Our next title is one that a lot of people probably haven't seen. You can find online. It was an actual academic project from a young animator training program in Japan, Anime Mirai. And this title, Arm Wrestle, Mechanized Fairies, brings out a lot of different themes. And it's a very short little part, but I like talking about it because it shows a different perspective. That we don't have to always have these mainstream titles that air on TV over in Japan and air on a streaming site here. We can see Cyberpunk's done in more of an academic environment. Now, this goal of this program was to give birth to new animators, and it did. 2 shows that were started from this project the same year as Arm Wrestle, Death Parade, with the iteration of Death Billiards, and Little Witch Academia. Without the Anime Mirai program, we wouldn't have those 2 shows. So this one was animated by Studio Zex, which worked also on Chrome Shell Regios. And it was a short film adaptation that takes place in, well, 2022. And this idea that you can access cyberspace and your whole nervous system, rather than just putting on a VR goggle, where your whole nervous system is pushed into cyberspace. But this short film is what happens when an accident occurs and you are trapped there. Their people's minds are trapped in cyberspace. Their souls endlessly searching through cyberspace to try to find a body, whether it's theirs or someone else's. This show deals with a lot of what a society controlled by cyberspace, which is controlled by a mega corporation, would be like. It kind of sounds a little bit like the very beginnings of Sword Art Online. But here, you're trapped in this world, in this very cyberspace, very futuristic piece. And while it's short, it leaves a lot to think about of what happens when our worlds that we can go into, the meta is controlled by a mega corporation. And what happens when you get captured and they kind of, you're just stuck in this space, you're run away, or you're stuck in this cyber world. You'll see a lot of common themes to some modern cyberpunk titles. The mechanized dogs, you'll see that in a live action, actually, cyberpunk, Black Mirror on Netflix. You'll see floating cities, and that is a huge staple in some cyberpunks, and we saw that in Battle Angel. It's 20 minutes, you can find it online, just search Anime Mirai Project, Arm Wrestle. Is available through the Anime Mirai program, or at least it was a few years back when I wrote this panel. And it's a really nice little short story. It kind of feels like an episode out of Black Mirror, which is really, it ties in a lot of different topics that you can hear about and focus on. As we go through the 2010s, our next title is Harmony. This was part of the Project Ito trilogy. Other 2 films of this were Empire of Corpses and Genocidal Oregon. Here we blend cyberpunk, nanopunk, and biopunk together into the age-old utopia versus dystopia society. But here we have a medical-based society. It's run by 2 really big technologies at the time. The Watchmate, which is these nanotubes, these nanobodies that are inside your body, and they monitor you, make sure you're healthy, and they make sure that you're all set. And Medicare, which is a home pharmacy to fix pretty much any problem that Watchmate finds. A lot more efficient than Medicare that we have here. We see a lot of medical devices used kind of as a cybernetic world, such as AR contact lenses that let you see what other people are. Hey, I can look at you and I know what your name is. Or, oh, I can see your whole history by just looking at you. A society dominated by basically the medical world, a mega corporation there. Everyone kind of has a rating. But rather than being a crime rating like Psycho Pass, it's a rating of how selfless you are. And then finally, in here we talk about the Harmony program. There's where you get the title of the show, the film from. And this idea that you can remove any brain desires and you have a perfect world. No one desires anything different. Everyone does the same thing. It's perfect. All we have to worry about is human consciousness, and we can just get rid of that, and we'll be all set to go. Harmony is a good twist of juxtaposition between feelings, emotions. The world itself is very pink. White and red are the 2 colors that we see very often. Pink is meant to be pure, charming, polite, the society that the government and the medical corporations want you to be in. It's perfect. Any problem you have, we'll fix that with modern medicine. But as we fuse, we see more red. Red is bloodshed, dark. This mix of color as really the driving factor of the theme here is that society is very different in harmony. We see that when you combine these colors, a little bit of red in a utopia uncovers a lot of different things. Our main character, Tuan, with red hair, and the rest of her World Health Organization that she's part of, they wear deep red and black, a big juxtaposition over the peacefulness that's made the world, this pinkness. They're the ones that strike fear in others. It draws a lot back to the themes we talked about with Appleseed in the 80s, and kind of depicts a lot of different things. Now I will warn you, the next slide, there is a little bit of blood, so just so you know. But that was a big use that was in the show, is that it's peaceful and health is supposed to be all clean, it's a very sterile environment, and then you have a very unsterile environment with someone who's dying and squirting blood all over the place. So Tuan in the World Health Organization, she's trying to find her way out of this utopian society and just find her purpose. She relives a lot of her past. It's her journey into her soul that we follow along throughout this, searching for her reason for being, her raison d'etre, through a world that drives her through trying to get this straight and narrow path of just obey and be there in society and just do what we're telling you to do, and you'll be healthy, happy, and living for a very long time. It's a similar theme that we see in 2016 Kiznaiver, except here we're joining together this quest of the Kiznaiver program, the Kizna system, that allows you to share human emotions. So rather than healthcare being our driving factor, it's emotion that's our driving factor here. And that a medical company basically can be our pure trying to join people together type of thing. Because if everyone experiences the same emotions, the same pain, they'll understand each other better. Well, that's what they tried to do. So in this cyberpunk-esque world that fuses dark and decay and destruction with a happy-go-lucky super park, sunshine and rainbows type of thing, juxtaposing this normal society with this new, tainted, destroyed society. We see red skies, dark elevators, beautiful sunshine, happiness, smiles, all tied into one. Because they want to show that all those emotions, you can feel them all together. But it drives people apart. And here, that one of the biggest emotions is who you are, your darkest identity, your darkest secrets. That's the first quest that our Kizna system, I must be having a lot of fun over there. That Kizna system is kind of fusing these different parts together and allowing you to really be one, as long as you share your desires and your secrets. One last thing on Kiznaiver that I want to chat about is just this idea of connectivity that it brings. And a really cool thing that Trigger did in this show was the architecture. And I always found this really interesting, where the street light for walking is holding hands, or you cross across these bridges that are all connected and going off on different paths. Just like Kiznaiver as the Kizna system is connectivity, here the whole world is depicted as connectivity. So as we finally wrap up into our society that we see in here, that the future, the 2020s, where we're going, where we want to be. Now we're fusing a lot of the cyberpunks, steampunks, biopunks, and all that together. Train punk is a huge thing. Punks are all over the place. Whatever you can think of, all these different ways that we depict our society, depict this world, that is kind of where we're going. Cyberpunk is pulling from a lot of different things. There's a lot of titles I could talk about for the 2020s. I'm going to put one that has a lot of references to a lot of other shows. But 3 more recent shows that came out. The first one airing now is Tokyo 24th Ward, which deals a lot with AI, controlling and policing society and trying to prevent crime, similar to Psycho Pass. We have Vivy, Fluorite Eye's Song, which is about an android trying to find her identity. her purpose, and how that purpose drives her throughout the series. And we have Hypnosis Mike, Division Rap Battle, which is exactly that, a rap battle show. But instead, we're going to talk about Akudama Drive quickly. This is a 2020 anime. It was written by Kazutaka Kodoka, who is known for Danganronpa. Here it was inspired by Quentin Tarantino's 1992 Reservoir Dogs. A bunch of villains ganging together to solve on this quest. It was a setting of a mix of cyberpunk and steampunk, fusing these colorful environments and landscapes and this grayscale world around us. Influenced by Blade Runner and Ghost in the Shell, and you'll see the look in this next image, kind of those tales. It gave us this story of a bunch of villains, all both working together and, well, you know, working apart for their own true purpose. It did have a lot of references to Detroit Becoming Human with some of the character designs, Akira, even comparisons to Judi Dench and Natalie Portman, and its episode titles were inspired by a lot of different films. So with Akudama Tribe, we saw a city of Osaka and Kansai, a city that was a lot more like what Americans thought Tokyo would look like. Here it fused the 60s and 70s look of bright lights and flashiness with character designs that had a lot of value and designs representing style and personality. This is a show, and if you have not seen it, you need to go find it, Akudama Drive. I'm not going to spoil anything. But it's riddled with this idea that, hey, there are seven individual people that come together. They all have dark desires. They all try to develop who they are, and how a simple quest can be a lot more challenging when you have these individuals, especially when you have a lot of technology trying to force them through. So we'll wrap up this panel with kind of where Cyberpunk will go from here. We do see more Ghost in the Shell. We see Salem Complex 2045, which is a CGI Ghost in the Shell. We see Blade Runner coming to anime, Blade Runner Black Lotus. And we see a lot of Netflix cyberpunk shows that fuse with anime, such as Altered Carbon, Re-Sleep. Netflix is really heavily embracing cyberpunk. We do see it on the non-anime side as well, with some recent films like Battle Angel Alita, Ghost in the Shell, and eventually, possibly, if it ever gets off the ground, a live-action Akira. We see it on Netflix with Black Mirror and Love, Death, and Robots, and we even see it in video games with Cyberpunk 2077 and Detroit Become Human. Cyberpunk is no longer in the backseat, it is now taking a huge role in society. So my last thing, the last point I leave you is this. While technology is important and it's a huge driver of cyberpunk, the real important factor to leave with is that your identity is yours. If you find it, you can overcome it. That is what so many cyberpunk stories want to tell. It's an adapting, ever-changing, boundless genre. But at the end of the day, it's who are you that's the most important. Thank you guys for coming out tonight. It was a pleasure presenting this for you. I hope that you left with a lot more information than you started with. If you do have any questions, feel free to ask me after the panel. I'll be outside this room. Have an awesome, awesome Zenkaikon and enjoy.